Today's short lecture is on virtue ethics, in particular from the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the most famous and interesting philosophers to have ever lived. He was the student of Plato, who, as we discussed previously, was the student of Socrates. And Aristotle actually ended up going on to teach a number of famous people, including Alexander the Great, who took over the known world at the time. Aristotle's theory of ethics is called virtue ethics, and it focuses rather than on actions and whether or not actions are good or bad or right or wrong. It focuses instead on character traits. It focuses on individual people and whether or not a person is good or bad and lives a good or bad life. The way that this focuses, the way that this focus sort of narrows is by discussing what we call virtues and vices, where virtues are good character traits and vices are bad character traits. The moral aim of a virtue ethical theory, at least on Aristotle's view, is this thing he calls eudaimonia, which ultimately means something like close to happiness or to live a flourishing life. And the central argument that Aristotle gives for focusing on virtuous character traits and aiming at eudaimonia is what we might call the function argument. So we're going to go through each of these notions now. Aristotle starts his theorizing about ethics not from a place of discussing the rightness or wrongness of actions or whether or not something is good or bad. Instead, he takes a larger view and wants to situate thinking about ethics as part of thinking about your entire life, an entire life, and what it is for someone to live a life that's worth living. He thinks that ethics, like how you live your life, the way that you do good in the world, is intertwined fundamentally with living a good life on the whole. And so the first thing that Aristotle asks when thinking about ethics is what in life is worth pursuing? What exactly is it that we ought to be trying to do in life? And how then that should sort of help us understand what it is that we should be doing in our day-to-day existence. So you might think like, well, what exactly is it that constitutes, a worthy pursuit in life? You might think like, oh, well, doing well in school. Well, that's great, but what does that get you? Well, maybe that gets you to doing well in your job. Okay, great. What does that get you? Well, maybe that allows you to have a family and, have money in order to continue your life, your livelihood. Okay, great. Um, Having a good life in that respect, having a family, great. Well, what does that get you? Well, ultimately, the idea here is it's not that it gets you just this like feeling of pleasure, but on Aristotle's view, what he ultimately thinks is that you ought to be pursuing this fulfillment, this sort of ultimate happiness that's not just a feeling, but it's something that from the outside looking in looks good. It looks full. It is a full, flourishing, complete life. Aristotle ultimately says then that the thing that's worth living about life and the thing that's worth doing in the end, he thinks, is to try to live a life that is a flourishing one, whatever that ultimately is going to end up meaning. It's sort of obvious that if you're going to live a life, you should live a life that's flourishing just by the understanding of what the word flourishing means. But ultimately, that's what Aristotle means by eudaimonia. He thinks, look, the thing that's worth pursuing in life is the flourishing life. And whatever ultimately ends up being a flourishing life, that's the thing that should set all of our goals and all of our ways in which we are going to live. Now, focusing on what it is to live a flourishing life, Aristotle, asks, well, okay, what is it to live well as a human being? What exactly goes into living a flourishing human life? Well, there's lots of things that you might point to just from your experiences of your humanity so far, right? Things like your family, having a lot of friends, being generally happy, feeling happiness, being successful in your endeavors, making a lot of money in order to achieve things, in order to buy things, in order to have things, having some form of emotional stability, not being, constantly depressed or constantly filled with anxiety about, situations, having your health, and finally, you really ultimately need a lot of luck in a way to live a life that's ultimately flourishing, right? Like if you live a really great life and then you die tragically in a car accident, it looks like you didn't live. I mean, maybe you lived a great life while you were alive, but you had a tragic ending. Um, Now, all of these things are the kinds of things that Aristotle would think go into living this full, complete, best of all possible lives. And that's the kind of thing he really thinks that we should be aiming at. We should be trying to make our lives the best of all possible lives that we could imagine. And the question then becomes, well, okay, how could we possibly achieve this kind of life? What would it take? Like, what do we have to do in order to get to the best of all possible lives? And ultimately, he thinks that there's a certain form of what we might call, what we might think of as cultivation that we can do as individuals to try and achieve the best possible life alongside having a lot of luck, right? So you've got to be really lucky, that your life doesn't end early, that you don't get some disease, that your parents don't, mess with you when you're a child, that nobody else messes with you. Like all these things are things that you are outside of your control. But then there are some things that are within your control that you can do to ultimately come to live a flourishing human life. Aristotle makes the connection between living a flourishing life and virtues clear by drawing on a kind of example. And this example uses what we will call the function argument. So if the human aim, the human purpose, is to live some kind of flourishing life, well, we should be able to think about purposes of different things in order to get a grasp on what it is to fulfill a purpose and what it is to be good at fulfilling a purpose. So take the idea of a knife. What is the purpose of a knife? What is a knife for? Well, the answer obviously is to cut, right? So knives are used for cutting, and that's the point of having a knife. That's the point of using a knife. You could, of course, hang a knife on a wall and look at it as if it were a piece of art, but then it wouldn't be functioning as a knife, right? It'd be functioning as a piece of art in that context. So when a knife is functioning as a knife, which means it's functioning to cut, a knife can be good or bad at cutting, right? A knife can cut well, or it can cut poorly. So something can be good at cutting and something can be bad at cutting in the same way that Aristotle wants to think a human person could be good at living their life or could be bad at living their life. They could be living a good life or living a poor life. So now, what exactly though does it take for a knife to cut well? What makes a knife a good knife? Well, the knife has to be probably of a certain size and of a certain weight. It can't be flimsy. It needs to be sharp. It needs, all of these features are necessary for a knife to be a good knife insofar as it does its job well, right? You need the knife to not be flimsy, otherwise it won't cut straight through things. It needs to be sharp because otherwise it won't actually cut, right? You need a handle, otherwise you won't be able to hold it to use it for what it's being used for. Now, each of these things Aristotle thinks of as a virtue of a knife. These are all traits of the knife. These are all properties that the knife has or lacks. And the virtues of a knife are the properties of the knife, the features of the knife, that make it good at serving its purpose. So if the knife cuts, if the purpose of the knife is to cut, then the features that make the knife good at serving its purpose are those features that make it good at cutting. So that's ultimately, on Aristotle's view, a virtue of a knife. The virtue of a knife is going to be those features of the knife that make the knife good at cutting, that make the knife good at serving its purpose. And the same thing is going to go across the board for this notion of virtue. So if you can find something and determine what its purpose is, then you can figure out what the virtues are for that kind of thing, because the virtues are basically just those traits of that kind of thing that get you at that kinds of thing's purpose well, right? So you might think of any other kind of thing, right? Like take like an automobile, a car. The car's purpose is to, transport you somewhere. And the virtues then of a car are that the car runs well, that it gets you from A to B. You could think like, oh, other virtues, that it gets you there cheaply, right? Has good fuel efficiency, that it gets you there in one piece, right? You don't end up getting scraped or burned or something. That it gets you there, covered, right? Like comfortable. These are all virtues of a car, and then the same thing is ultimately going to go for human beings. The way Aristotle uses the function argument to discuss human living, so takes the focus or aim of a human life as to live a flourishing human life, to be happy, but in this sort of full sense of living a complete and, extremely, from the outside, looking great life. And then the question becomes, well, how does one achieve that purpose, right? So what does one have to do in order to come to have a flourishing life, where a flourishing life involves all of the great things about life being part of it? Well, you have to do a bunch of stuff, right? You have to live well. You have to do good. You have to do right by people. You're right. You can't end up in prison or dead. You need to do basically what he thinks of as the right things in the right situations in the right ways. And the only ways that we can really do all of those things in order to attempt to achieve our own flourishing lives is to what he thinks of as cultivating the character traits, the human character traits, that help us to achieve and have the abilities that allow us to do well in all of the possible situations that we might face, right? And if we were to face a particular situation and we are able to act in the right way in that situation to do the right thing, then he thinks like that's the kind of that's showing what it is to live a flourishing human life. Now, this has been all rather abstract so far, but we can sort of now come to see the human virtues, the things that Aristotle wants to make core to an ethics of human life, are ultimately going to be those traits that help someone to function well in their pursuit of their flourishing, of making their life flourish. So human virtues are really those traits that people can have or develop that allow them to live well. Whereas vices, on the other hand, are going to be any of those traits that detract from living well. So like, generally people think of vices in the sort of classic way of being someone that is a drunkard, or being someone that discusses things with others that they shouldn't, a gossip, right? Different kinds of vices that you might have. You might be lazy. A lazy would be having a vice. You might be too fearful. And that brings us to a good example of a human virtue, which is the example of courage. Aristotle gives a doctrine, he calls it the doctrine of the golden mean, where he thinks that basically virtues exist on a kind of spectrum when it comes to human proclivities or human actions, human tendencies to act in certain ways. And the spectrum basically is like a line where there's excess on either side of the line, and the golden mean in the middle, where the golden mean is supposed to be where the virtue lies on this line. Now take the example of courage, and we can see how this situation is supposed to work. There are two different vices that are associated with courage. Um, Basically, both of these are on, or all three of these are on the same line, where the line is supposed to represent how someone might act in a case in which they were confronted with something dangerous or scary. And you can have two, or you can ultimately have three different responses, right? I mean, you could have an infinite number of responses, but there are three types of responses that we generally recognize. One would be a certain kind of vice, the defect of cowardice, right? So if you were to come across, I mean, I like to think of this in a dumb medieval way, right? You come across, you're a medieval knight, you come across the dragon, then you have to say, you have to save the princess, you have to slay the dragon to save the princess. And you come across the dragon. Well, there are a few different ways that you might respond. The first way that you might respond would be to be a coward, to be like, oh, that dragon is pretty big, pretty scary. I am not strong enough to defeat it. And so you might, turn tail and run away, um, thereby sacrificing the princess, right? Or something like that. Now, that would be a vice. That would be the vice of cowardice. You acted in a way that, took things into consideration, and you overfelt the fear, right, of the situation, and, so on and so forth. The other excess that you could possibly feel in this case would be that of overconfidence. Suppose that you just don't feel any fear in the face of the dragon, and you're pompous, and you think, ah, easy, I'll go defeat the dragon and save the princess, and everybody will love me. And so you just ride out in front of the dragon, sort of attack it face on, and it burns you to a crisp, right? I mean, this is the other kind of vice here along these lines. In a dangerous situation, if someone is overconfident and doesn't actually take adequate precaution, with respect to the danger, then they're going to get burned. Whereas the virtuous mean, the golden mean in this case, the courageous person, is the person that acts in such a way as to both recognize the fear and danger, like feel the fear, recognize the danger, and yet still ultimately take the steps to overcome that fear and do the right thing in how they respond. So in this case, hopefully the idea would be the person recognizes that the dragon is dangerous, but then hatches a plan to defeat the dragon without, exposing themselves too much to the danger. Something like that, right? That would be the courageous person that actually accomplishes the goal. Now, there are, of course, a number of other virtues. Here's just an example of some of them. And the virtues lie in the golden mean between the differences of excess and deficiency, basically, where the thought is, with respect to one line of ways that someone might act in a particular situation, there are deficient ways and there are excess ways. And then there's the golden mean, which is perfectly in the middle. And so, I mean, you might think of it this way too. There's this example here of like temperance, licentiousness, and insensibility. Imagine someone that is, when it comes to having a good time at a party or something like that. You might have someone that goes to a party and they're a teetotaler, like they don't want to drink, they think other people are being bad by doing things that are fun, and they have a deficiency in this situation. Similarly, you might have an excess, a person that is drunk all the time and does way too much, and tries to have, tries to have so much fun that they overdo it and kind of bring down the party or hurt someone, or they're too loud and the cops get called, something like that. Whereas the golden mean is the perfect amount, right? You go, you have as much fun as you possibly can without destroying anything, harming yourself or others, etc. So we might return to the question of how ultimately we should live and how we should be good people, how we should be moral. Well, according to Aristotle, we need to ultimately attempt to cultivate virtuous character traits in ourselves. So we need to try to meet the golden mean with respect to each of these kinds of situations. Of course, there's lots of what we might call moral luck in the world, right? So bad things happen to good people, and that's a bummer. But how is it that we can ultimately determine when someone is a good person anyway? Well, that's because that person has cultivated certain virtuous character traits, so that even in the face of adversity, even in the face of difficult times, even in the face of ultimately being unlucky, they can strive and rise above, in a way, in a sense, by ultimately rolling with the punches and living in the best possible way given the situations at hand. And the way that we do that is by having these character traits. For the most part, Aristotle thinks we know what character traits are the ones that are good to cultivate. This has caused some debate because there's lots of different ways of living a life well, it seems. But we might, at least for the most part, we've probably got a good number of the character traits down, like the ones that I just showed you in the last slide. And Aristotle recognizes too that it's hard to necessarily motivate yourself to cultivate these virtues, but he thinks that we should try. He thinks that insofar as there's any semblance of control that we have over our own lives, this is the point at which we can try to be good and do good. Supposing that we have any semblance of free will at all, and that we have any control outside of the forces that are acting upon us, trying to cultivate the virtues is the best thing that we can do to try and live a good life, and that is part of what it is to be moral. So then he thinks that in our day-to-day lives, what we need to do is recognize what it would be to live the best possible life, and what the kind of virtuous person is that is able to live that kind of life, and how they would act in a situation of adversity in which you might be, in that day. So if you come into a situation in which you're like, oh man, I don't know what to do, Aristotle's thought is, well, you should think about what the person that's living the best possible life, that has the best possible, they've cultivated these virtues within themselves, what would that person do? He thinks that if you think that way and then you try to act that way, I mean, this is literally like the what would Jesus do of moral theories, but he thinks that if you think that way and then you try to act that way, then ultimately you'll be emulating the virtuous person, to the point at which eventually, if you continue to emulate the virtuous person, you will become a virtuous person. Because you constantly are emulating them, and then you're internalizing the thoughts and processes for why ultimately that way of acting is the best way of acting. And then once you've internalized those processes, you've basically built those character traits in yourself. And so Aristotle thinks that that's really the best possible way to live a flourishing human life and to develop within yourself the kinds of things that you need to do and be in order to be a good person. And then he thinks that ultimately being a good person comes first, and that all actions, good or bad and right or wrong, kind of flow from being the kind of person that you are. And so in a way, this is very different from the earlier theories that we looked at. So the utilitarian theory starts from a theory of what is good, and then tries to explain what it is to do an action that's right or wrong, and what it is to be a good person in virtue of explaining what is good in the first place. Whereas a deontological approach tries to say, no, here's the basis of the theory is the theory of right. There's things that are right and that are wrong, and then the things that are right are the good things, the things that are wrong are the bad things, and the person that acts in ways that does wrong things, does bad things, becomes a bad person. The person that does things that are right, does good things, and becomes a good person. Well, instead, the virtue theory says, no, look, there's this notion of good person that comes from trying to understand what it is that a person is for, what the person's function is, what persons are trying to do. And if people are trying to live flourishing good lives, where we recognize what it is to live a good life sort of already, then we can know how people should work, how people should act, and we should and from that we can derive what actions ultimately are right or wrong, good or bad. It's those actions that contribute to a flourishing life and don't detract from, your own flourishing life and other people's flourishing lives. Finally, Aristotle recognized that different people have different traits. Not everybody is the same height, not everybody has the same amount of muscle. Some things come easy to some people, some things are hard for others. Ultimately, on this basis, Aristotle recognized that from a political standpoint, what we ought to do is attempt to distribute the available goods that we have to those individuals with respect to their needs and with respect to their gifts, right? So this kind of comic here is an attempt at making fun of this way of thinking, but also is sort of spot on for Aristotle. If someone is able to do something very well with, if someone is a really good flute player, if someone is really good at basketball, if someone is really good at math and going to help us, if someone is a really good leader, we ought to try to separate or set up our society in such a way as to contribute the most to those people where they have needs and where we're going to meet them and set them up for success. So the whole kind of idea of getting a person to live a flourishing life. So you take like that's the point of living a human life. But what's the point of living in a society? What's the point of living what's the point of a government? What's the point of living socially with each other politically? And Aristotle thinks, well, you take the same idea, you take the same point, right? So what is it to live socially in a social framework with a lot of other people? Well, you're trying to make the society flourish. And if you're trying to make the society flourish, well, then you got to do the same kinds of things. You got to figure out what the virtues are for a society, what makes a society a good society. And then you got to figure out how to implement those things. And good societies generally are societies where everyone gets fed well, right? People are healthy, people are having a good time, there isn't a lot of squabbling and war, these kinds of things. And so ultimately, on the Aristotelian framework, what we should be trying to do politically, socially, and with respect to one another, is set up a society in which individuals flourish, and that brings flourishing to the whole of the society.